We are not our own, earth forms us. Human leaves on nature's growing vine, fruit of many generations, seeds of life divine. We are not alone, earth names us, past and present, peoples near and far, family and friends and strangers, show us who we are. Therefore let us make thanksgiving, and with justice willing and aware, give to earth and all things living liturgies of care. Let us be a house of welcome, living stone upholding living stone, gladly showing all our neighbors we are not our own. We are not our own, earth forms us, human leaves on nature's growing vine, fruit of many generations, seeds of life divine. We are not alone, earth names us, past and present, peoples near and far, family and friends and strangers, show us who we are. Therefore let us make thanksgiving, and with justice willing and aware, give to earth and all things living liturgies of care. Let us be a house of welcome, living stone upholding living stone, gladly showing all our. Welcome, welcome on this chilly January morning to this virtual sanctuary space of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Charleston, West Virginia. I'm the Reverend Caitlin Cotter-Coylberg, minister of this congregation, and I am joined for this service today by our virtual usher, Matt Connolly, our tech volunteer, Neil Chakrabarty, and our worship associate for today is Kate Jordan. We're so glad you are with us. Today's music is from our music director, Hannah Clark, and from, appropriately enough for this transcendentalist service, the Emerson Unitarian Universalist Church in Houston, Texas. As always, we are so grateful in this time for the generosity and sharing that is happening with Unitarian Universalists from all over. We're so glad, so grateful that you are with us today. And we begin, as we do each week now, with an invitation to generosity. So Neil and Matt, can you put up that first slide, please? There we go. So this is the moment in the service when I invite you to go grab a candle and maybe some matches for our chalice lighting moment, and to pull up your PayPal app or find your checkbook on an envelope or queue up the donate page on our congregation's web page. In the words of John Saxon, the light of our chalice would soon flicker and die without the oil that nourishes its flame. And just as this flame cannot burn without oil, this religious community cannot survive or thrive without the financial as well as personal support of its members and friends. The oil that keeps the flame of our liberal religious faith alive and fuels the shared mission and ministry of this congregation. So let us now give freely and generously an offering to sustain and strengthen our shared religious community, a community of memory, hope, faith, and love. For we are now the keepers of its flame that burns for justice, its dream of beloved community, its vision of a world made whole. And just a reminder, we as a congregation have begun the practice of giving 25% of our weekly offering to a community partner. And this month we are supporting the Mountaineer Food Bank, which of course provides food to so many hungry folks around our state. In this time of great need, it is more important ever than we do what we can to nourish each other, our neighbors around the state, and that we practice generosity as we are able. To give until it feels good is our invitation to you. A few other reminders about things happening. It is the 30 Days of Love happening right now with our Unitarian Universalist Association, and you can find out a ton about that if you type UUA plus 30 Days of Love, and there's all kinds of stuff going on there. There's stuff for kids. There's stuff that's about learning things and stuff that's about doing things, and all sorts of resources and invitations. Also want to remind you that if you are doing something in our community that you would like an invitation included in the Sunday morning service, please reach out to me before Sunday and I will fold it in to this getting settled into the service time. But for now, I invite you, if you are on Zoom and are so moved, to move into gallery view and turn on your camera if you are comfortable doing so that we can wave hello to each other. We can't hug each other. And of course, when we get back in person, we'll need to remember to ask before hugging. Consent is important, but we can show that we are holding each other in our hearts by holding our hands over our hearts, or this is American Sign Language shorthand for I love you. Love you. And I invite you to type into the chat box on Zoom or into the comments section on Facebook your hellos and your answer to their opening question, which is, where are you finding joy this week? What is bringing joy and helping sustain you this week? So feel free to type that into the chat box now, and you can type it in later too. So it's good to share our joys as well as our hurts as we are together while we are apart. And Kate, I invite you to bring us in with our opening words.
Today's opening words are by Sarah York. When Jesus was baptized, the Spirit descended upon him like a dove and said, "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased." It must have been a great feeling, but it didn't last long. The next thing Jesus knew, the nice Spirit that had descended like a dove became aggressive and drove him into the wilderness. There he spent 40 days of deprivation, self-examination, and confrontation with the devil. He suffered, he struggled, he was tested. Jesus' solitary struggles to remain true to his covenant and calling echo those of his ancestors who spent 40 years in the wilderness establishing a religious community. Wilderness is a part of every person's soul journey, and part of our journey together as human beings who seek to live in community. Time in the wilderness is always a time of struggle. It is also a time of transformation and renewal. In traditional terms, it is a time of purification. The journey into wilderness reminds us that we are alone and not alone. We are neither where we have been nor where we are going. There is danger and possibility, risk and promise. In the wilderness, the Spirit may descend like a dove and lift us on its wings of hope, then drive us into the depths of despair. It may affirm us with the gift of grace, then challenge us to change. In the stories and rituals of Eastern as well as Western religions, a journey into the wilderness represents a time when we both pursue and resist the holy. We may choose to enter the wilderness like the people of Yahweh, to escape bondage, or like Henry David Thoreau, to live deliberately. Or we may, like Jesus, be driven there without much choice. Once there, even our markers of time and space collapse, for this wilderness is not space or time, but is the boundless territory of the soul.
Winds be still, storm clouds pass and silence come. Peace grace this time with harmony. Fly, bird of hope, and shine, light of love, and in calm let all find tranquility. Bird fly high, lift our gaze toward distant view, help us to sense life's mystery. Fly high and far, and lead us each to see how we move through the winds of eternity. Light shining, illuminate our inward view, help us to see with clarity. Shine bright and true, so we may join our songs in new songs that become full symphony.
Kate, sorry, you're muted.
There we are. All right. Today's chalice lighting words are written by Ben Soul. Let us hold a quiet moment now as we light our chalice. Henry David Thoreau wrote in his journal on February 2nd, 1841. A child asked his father, what became of the old moon? And he said it was cut up into stars. Consider the light, light out of darkness. Light begets light. The light which the God of Genesis brought out of the darkness is the light that became our world. Our sun's light, reflecting off our moon, is eclipsed, but then returns to us as our earth quietly moves out of its way. In our current scientific understanding of the origins of the universe, the light of everything that exploded from not quite nothing is the light that became the maybe everything of which we are barely a part. The light we now kindle here will become a light for each of us to carry forth, and we may find our way through the shadows on our path. Let us be grateful for the light in our lives, even as we honor the dark from which the light came.
This story, adapted from the Tapestry of Faith curriculum Sing to the Power, is called Henry David Thoreau and the Still Small Voice. Henry sat in front of his little cabin on one of his 3 chairs, listening to the evening. If you were there, you might have thought there was nothing to listen to. Certainly no television or iPod, no Spotify music playlists or YouTube videos. Those wouldn't be around for a long time. There was no one to talk to that evening, no airplanes overhead, no voices coming from next door. Mr. Emerson's house, the closest thing to a next-door neighbor, was over a mile away. And even the natural world was still that evening as night approached. Still, Henry listened for the tiniest sounds. A small fish breaking the surface of the water and splashing down again, the crackle of leaves as a mouse passed by, the sound of wings as a crow passed overhead. To him, these miniature sounds were music. Now, most of the townspeople of Concord, Massachusetts thought Henry David Thoreau was pretty silly when he decided to build a tiny cabin from used materials out in Emerson's woodlot by Walden Pond. Why would a promising writer want to move away from society to sit with birds and bugs for company? Henry enjoyed the company of Emerson and the other thinkers who shared his transcendentalist philosophy, and he was close with his family. However, to him, the quiet of the pond and the animals and plants that live in and around it provided excellent company. Sometimes, Henry thought, the conversation you learn the most from is the one in which the least is said. As he watched the last rays of light glisten on the pond, Henry thought about the biblical story about the prophet Elijah, who crawled off to a mountain cave to listen for what God wanted him to do. While Elijah stood outside his cave, a great wind whipped around the mountains, sending boulders crashing to the ground in the fury of its passing. But God wasn't in the wind. Then an earthquake rattled the mountain with a terrific rumbling, but God wasn't in the earthquake. Then came a fire sweeping across the rocks and brush outside the cave, red and roaring and grand. But God wasn't in the fire either. Finally, after all the roaring and crashing, everything became quiet. Elijah stood there shaking, wrapped in his cloak, just waiting. And out of the silence came the still, small voice of his God. Not at all sure, thought Henry, that I believe in that God of the Bible, the one who chatted with Elijah. But whatever God is, I'm pretty sure I know it better out here in the quiet. Maybe God is speaking to me in the small voice of the jumping fish and the rustling leaves, the still pond, and the stars beginning to peek through the trees. Maybe I hear God when my heart is still and I can listen with my very smallest inner ear. Maybe. And his thoughts drifted off with a small breeze that came and ruffled his hair and rippled across the quiet
lake.
Wake now my senses and hear the earth call. Feel the deep power of being in all. Keep with the web of creation your vow. Giving, receiving as love shows us how. Wake now my reason, reach out to the new. Join with each pilgrim who quests for the true. Honor the beauty and wisdom of time. Suffer thy limit and praise the sublime. Wake now compassion, give heed to the cry. Voices of suffering fill the wide sky. Take as your neighbor both stranger and friend, praying and striving their hardship to end. Wake now my conscience, with justice thy guide. Join with all people whose rights are denied. Take not for granted a privileged place. God's love embraces the whole human race. Make now my vision of ministry clear. Brighten my pathway with radiant here. Mingle my calling with all who will share. Work toward a planet transformed by our care.
I now invite you in joining me in saying our unison affirmation. Love is the spirit of our faith, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. So this reflection, as we were discussing before the service, it was difficult to write because there's a whole lot to say. But this is what I came up with, was that I really enjoy solitude. It brings me peace. I smile when I think about it. And it hasn't been until I've gotten older that I started to connect my solitude with spirituality. I've never felt like I was alone. I've never felt lonely. But as I've gotten older, it was sort of like, this is just kind of as the little story we just heard from the for the RE kids, as I've gotten older, it's become something that it's like being alone is something that is peaceful, and in that peace something happens. So when I was a teenager, this is kind of, I mean, it seems like it's been an age ago, but early teen years, my mom bought me this book. It's a bit humongous, so it's a little cumbersome, but I'll show you. This big, huge book my mom bought me. And I remember that when I opened it up to the page that says my birthday, it says March 9, and I read the little descriptions about who I supposedly am. I remember being like, oh my gosh, that's crazy, because that's me. How does a book know exactly who I am? Wow. But then, you know, and then there's a little section over here that talks about, it assigns your birthday a tarot card. And that, when I got to that part, I've never really had a image or the description of an image and what it stands for resonate so much. So the card is the Hermit, and he's part of the major arcana of a tarot deck. And the description of this card, according to my birthday and personality, etc., is as follows. The ninth card of the major arcana is the Hermit, who is usually depicted walking with a lantern and a stick. He represents meditation, isolation, and quietude. The Hermit also signifies crystallized wisdom and ultimate discipline. He is a taskmaster who motivates by conscience and guides others on their path. And then the positive indications of this card are stick-to-itiveness, purpose, profundity, and concentration. And negative qualities include dogmatism, intolerance, mistrust, and discouragement. But over time, and I've come back to this book over the years, and over time, I've just always thought about this, and not because I look like this old man carrying a lantern, or not even because I really enjoy spending a whole lot of time outside. I'm kind of a homebody who enjoys my books and the comfort of blankets and warm. But I do find myself being someone who is a light bringer, a knowledge seeker, an old soul, someone who waits for the lights to go down. And when that happens, I come alive. Reverend Caitlin noted in her reflection this week that solitude is a choice. I am certainly a bubbly, extroverted person when I choose to be, but I oftentimes must retreat to the quiet to recharge and find my way in this crazy world. I remember when I first learned about Henry David Thoreau. It's a very distinct memory in my mind. I believe we had to take it was an elective, something, and I took a philosophy class. And funny enough, I was scrolling on Facebook yesterday, and there was a little meme that said something like, has everybody had an English teacher that changed their life? Yes. and that was in this class with Mr. Ed Booten. And and behind me, honestly, actually on this shelf over here is a notebook that I'm sure still has in it the packet that he gave us that was about this thick. And this was like, I think in about 11th grade, that on the front of it, as he introduced it to us, it was called The Isms. And we went through this whole unit of learning about everything that ended with ISMS. Isms. And so I remember when we got to Transcendentalism, and he taught it to us well, and we read Walden, and we had those conversations. And I remember even then, in my, I was always a reader and a thinker, and even then though, grasping it kind of and being like, okay, I get it, kind of. I get why this is a thing, why this was a movement, why people wanted to go out in nature and be alone with themselves and find this sort of, self-reliance. He wrote that and it made sense. And again, I'm so happy that I have that memory and that Mr. Booten taught us that. And at the time it was so scary. It was so scary to learn all those things, but it's something that I have come back to over and over again in my life and realized, like, without knowing, that I kind of like lived that way without knowing that I did. I grew up in the country. And even though my parents never really said, go chop wood or go gather the water from the well, it wasn't that country. But there was something about being isolated out there that when we came home, we were home. And we didn't have neighbors. And my friends lived 20 minutes away. And there wasn't texting, and it was come home and figure out how to entertain yourself. And a lot of that entertainment meant making up stories and playing in the woods and going outside, and you did not say, I'm bored. You found a way. And a lot of that time I spent alone. And even though I had siblings, I spent hours playing with dolls and making up stories and doing things by myself and just figuring out that that was okay. Again, the first time I ever went to I go in the summertime to a place called Wisteria that's a kind of a pagan group that gets together. And the first time I ever went, I went alone. I only knew 2 people at this huge event that was in the middle of nowhere. And I had no idea. And I was kind of in the midst of sort of healing from sort of having broken up from a relationship and just kind of needing to decompress. And I remember the first time I went there and spent 3 days at this place and then came home, and the feeling that I had, and it's almost indescribable. It was just so, what it did for me to just be outside in the quiet with the woods and the leaves and the trees and just be, and not have a phone and not have emails and just to just enjoy what was natural. And when I came home, I remember just feeling like, wow, this world is different than that one. And it took adjusting, and it was strange. And again, it made me, as I was writing this, I was like, I get it. I get why the Transcendentalist movement was something that was attractive to people. In a sense, its idealism makes it sort of magical. Thoreau notes that his ideas came from Native Americans, and in his text Walden, there's a direct link to Dharmic and Indic religions. In my own personal perspective, I think that that's why this strikes me as something, because I've always been attracted to more Eastern thought and things that were just different, not the same old. And it's funny that I'm looking at these notes that I made here, and I've got a note here that says, make sure to restate your thesis. So, and restating my thesis, which is, I get it because it's a connection to something bigger, which makes sense, to be out in nature and listen to the universe. There's a line in the movie V for Vendetta, and she's gone, the protagonist has gone through this ordeal, and the antagonist, I guess you would say, is trying to get her to come to terms with her fear. And when she does, she says, God is in the rain. And she stands outside and it's raining, and she puts her hands up and she says, God is in the rain. And that line has always just struck me, because I don't know what God is, and I don't claim to know. And I'm certainly not this guy. I mean, I feel like, I'm trying to live up to this, but God is in the rain. And when we're outside and we're with nature, it makes sense why people feel the way they do, and they feel the pull to be there. So go outside and listen to what the universe is telling you, because sometimes I think the answers are there. So what questions do you have? Go outside and look up and say, help. Ask a question. Ask the stars your question. Thank you.
For the beauty of the earth, for the splendor of the skies, for the love which from our birth over and around us lies, source of all to thee we raise this high hymn of grateful praise. for the joy of here and I, for the heart and mind's delight, for the mystic harmony, linking sense to sound and sight, source of all to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. For the wonder of each hour of the day and of the night, hill and vale and tree and flower, sun and moon and stars of light, source of all to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. For the joy of human care, sibling, cousin, parent, child, for the kinship we all share, for all gentle thoughts and mild, source of all to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise.
Each week, we light a second candle for those affected by COVID-19, which is all of us, and some of us more than others. And this candle is also to hold all of the sorrows, all of the things we are holding each other in our hearts. So as I light this candle, I invite you to type in the chat box on Zoom or the comments section of Facebook who or what is on your heart, what you want held in the heart of this congregation. We hold all of those grieving folks who have died of COVID and all those managing the trauma and painful uncertainty that has marked these past few months. Even if you are feeling relief, many of us have carried trauma and uncertainty in our bodies. We hold all those who are ill or facing difficulties. I invite you to join us in holding our lay leader, Peter Harris, in our hearts as he is in the hospital right now. The Jordans as they navigate some difficult times. And two, we hold the joys of this time, the simple joys that Thoreau knew so well, right? Of housekeeping, cleaning our houses, of being in nature, feeding the chickadees and the squirrels and the chipmunks and so on, and being with friends and discussion group, loving our families, biological and chosen. So many joys, so many sorrows that we hold together as a community. And of course, we continue to hold in our hearts all those families who were separated at the border and those of all ages and genders who continue to be held in our nation's concentration camps. May all of us know freedom from bondage and trauma and violence. And I invite you into a moment of prayer, meditation. I invite you to perhaps settle your feet on the floor, your hands in your lap. You may wish to close your eyes or focus your eyes on a candle flame. And I offer you this prayer by Kenneth P. Langer. Let me find peace within, so that I may be calm throughout. Let me find silence within, so that I may find compassion throughout. Let me be reminded that some things are worth waiting for. Let me be reminded that the journey is more important than reaching the destination. Let me see that the not doing is as much a part of life as the doing. Let me be reminded that it is in these moments of holding on that I can find quietude and renewal. It is within these times of inaction that I can find rest. It is in these times of emptiness that I can become full. And I invite you to join me in a minute of quiet contemplation with the sounds of the world around us. Amen. Blessed be. Please join me in singing along to our meditative hymn.
Voice still and small, deep inside all, I hear you call, singing. In dark and rain, sorrow and pain, still you remain, singing. Calming my fears, quenching my tears, through all the years, singing. Voice still and small, deep inside all, I hear you call, singing. In storm and rain, sorrow and pain, still you remain, singing. Calming my fears, quenching my tears, through all the years, singing.
And that, of course, was Hannah Clark singing that meditative hymn. So, one of the lesser known things about Henry David Thoreau is how much he loved puns, that he wrote hundreds of super nerdy puns into his writing. So, as we honor his legacy today, I offer you a few punny jokes about him. Here's one. Why was Walden such a good book? Thorough editing. Get it? Thorough editing. Why couldn't Henry David Thoreau leave his house? It was Walden. A college student is talking to their father and says, "Sometimes, Dad, I just want to quit my horrible jobs, take a gap year from school, and move home to live in a tiny house on the edge of town, practicing urban farming." "Oh no," says their dad, "don't throw your life away." So there aren't a lot of jokes out there about people important in Unitarian Universalist history, so I enjoy even the super corny ones. And I feel like Thoreau in particular would appreciate that not only has his thinking on civil disobedience led to generations of nonviolent resistance to oppression, and his depictions of life and nature inspired environmentalists and urban garden activists and outdoor enthusiasts and nature writers, but also he's still so relevant and well known 150 years later that people make corny jokes celebrating him. You can find pages upon pages of Thoreau puns if you go looking. I think that the book Walden in particular has been a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For example, since I learned about the death of Thoreau's beloved brother, who died in Thoreau's arms of Lockjaw, I've always read Walden in part as a book about grieving. His brother died just a couple of years before he did this experiment of going and living at Walden, and he built the cabin by the lake to get some distance while staying connected, to spend time observing nature and reading and thinking. And he was also using that time as a writer's retreat, not to write what we now know as Walden. He wrote that much later. He was writing a book about a trip he took with his brother. I dream of a world where we can give every grieving person the time and space they need after a traumatic death or life event, right? Not that everyone needs to sit by a small lake for 2 years, but so rarely do our lives allow for grieving, for remembering, for whatever we need to process our feelings and cultivate resilience and hope and joy. Rarely do our modern lives allow room for us to be people or allow room for our humanity, and that hurts all of us. Researchers like social psychologist Dr. Devin Price are calling on us to stop thinking of folks as lazy for not being constantly productive because, on the one side, there's lots of reasons why people can't or don't work, but also because our brains generally work best in short bursts. And it would be better for us as a society and as individuals to let go of the value of overcommitment and overwork and embrace things like shorter work weeks. In fact, they've shown that if you shorten someone's work week, they get just as much work done and are happier and healthier. So Price, who recently wrote a book about how there is no such thing as laziness, I'm pretty sure that's like the title of the book, There's No Such Thing as Laziness, names that the pressure to overwork and overcommit is interwoven into American history. This is part of our history, is this tendency to overwork and to shame each other into overcommitting, and that a vast majority of people are being asked to do more than is psychologically or physically possible, and then feeling shame and a sense that they will never be enough when they cannot live into impossible standards. That every attempt to increase productive hours past the 3 or 4 hours of real work a person can do in a day has resulted in failure, because it's not how people function. We aren't productivity machines. We need rest, we need contemplation, we need social connection and play, and a life beyond what we produce. And of course, that work doesn't always look like just churning out capital. Researchers are seeing that in the pandemic, it has become even more clear how unjust and harmful our expectations and our distrust of each other is. That productivity has actually went up when people started getting to work from home, but mental health declined under pressure from toxic work environments where people aren't trusted to do what needs to be done and instead have to be constantly proving that they are working. Dr. Price says, one thing I really advocate for is a person getting a chance to check in with what their true values are, not what society says they should be doing, and to really determine for themselves what they want their lives to look like. I love that thanks to Henry David Thoreau and so many other poets and dreamers in philosophy, that also is a call that rings through American history, right? Carved into a wooden sign by Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts is this quote: I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. In the book, the quote goes on, I do not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor do I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out the marrow of life. I love that quote, except maybe the bit about marrow because I'm a vegetarian and I'm like, yay, every time. Anyway, I love that quote the way Thoreau loved puns and his mama, who, yes, did his laundry while I was sitting by a pond living deliberately, just as he went into town to continue doing chores for his mother. He stayed in community while practicing solitude in a lot of ways. I love that quote because it sets us up for a better narrative of what our goals can and should be, not of producing capital, right? But something else, something deeper, something more personal. And I like it because it hints the depth of feeling that Thoreau seems to have trouble otherwise expressing. Deborah Beatty and I were emailing back and forth this week about Thoreau, how his life was a privileged one, and he was also burdened by the weight of toxic masculinity that gave no room for grief. His writing can be tough to read. I know I always struggle with his work, right? I was talking about this with another young friend this week. It makes me cranky, just as it's made generations of young feminists and activists cranky before me. So much of his privilege and his misogyny and other stuff goes unexamined, even as he beautifully questions systems like capitalism that grind so many to dust. And his approach to these problems that he sees is very individualistic. He was not a social change organizer, not a union man, not really, in some ways, a systems change thinker. So I struggle with it. But like Kate, I keep going back to Walden because there's something gorgeous and inspiring in his work to live deliberately, in his cranky, creative, problematic descriptions and explanations of his time in the woods. And something accessible too, right? Like Walden Pond is right on the outskirts of his hometown where he lived with his friends and family. You can still walk to there from Emerson's house in the middle of Concord. Thoreau wanted time in nature, but he didn't get on a ship or a train and head out for far away mountains or sweeping vistas. He stayed close by in a familiar and unassuming and public bit of wilderness. And I love that in many ways, the wilderness he was in was metaphorical, like that opening reading Kate read, right? That wilderness is something we go through in our life. He was traveling through the wilderness of grief, the wilderness of not knowing what to do with his life, right? And so he went and found a little bitty bit of hometown wilderness to explore that. I found myself yesterday looking at reviews of Walden Pond and TripAdvisor, right? Because I always find it funny. I always find it funny when I read reviews about Walden, which is I know that's a weird thing to be potentially looking at as part of sermon prep. Sermon prep takes us in some weird places. I always find it a little funny how many people think Walden is some remote wilderness location, right? So many people have an idea of what Walden is about and haven't really read it. And then they're surprised to discover it is basically a town park and has been basically just like a little bit of public land on the edge of town for hundreds of years, right? So I always think that's funny when people are like, oh, it was so noisy. I'm like, yeah, it's right there in town. It's not like, anyway. But I also found myself struck reading those reviews by the number of people saying how much it helped them just to go and take an hour to walk around that little kettle lake or sit on its edge. That so many of us are finding that taking our hearts outside or bringing nature in however we can is helping us get through the heartbreaking isolation of these pandemic times, helping us to avoid practicing resignation, helping us to resist capitalist notions that our worth is in our productivity, and especially helping us with grief. Because I think spending time in nature reminds us of just how connected we are to what we Unitarian Universalists call the interdependent web of all existence, right? And Kate, you talked about how in solitude you don't feel lonely. And I think that for many of us, when we go out in nature, we are reminded of the power of solitude, of how much we are not alone in whatever we're going through. And that's important because there is so much to grieve right now. And sometimes we just have to let our hearts rest in whatever beauty, or perhaps whatever wildness we can find. I love Wendell in his poem Wood Drink wrote about this particularly beautifully when he talked about how when despair for the world grows into him, he goes and lies down where the wood drake rests on the water and the great heron feed. He wrote, I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. And of course, the great Mary Oliver in her poem, The Summer Day, wrote, I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Tell me, What is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Is perhaps Mary Oliver's famous quote. And it's worth noting that her answer to that intimidating question was to go strolling around in fields, right? And that doesn't have to be your answer. And I say that too because listening to it, I'm thinking about part of what she's writing about is spirituality, right? As Kate mentioned too, spirituality and how we find it. That Mary Oliver is asking, what are you doing with your wild and precious life? How are you finding ways to be centered, to be feeding yourself spiritually? For her, it was found in fields. Some people find it in all kinds of places, in books, in warm caffeinated beverages can be a spiritual experience if you approach them mindfully, right? That it's about doing what feeds you, what keeps you nourished. And I love that even though he also spent a lot of time wandering around by himself, that also wasn't all of Thoreau's answer. What he was doing in those 2 years he stayed in his little makeshift house was being in community in a radically different way. Staying connected to those he loved, involved in the life of his town. If you read the book, there's all these, he's always talking about what everyone else is doing and what they're saying to him. Like he wasn't away from his town, he was in the life in a different way. He was involved in a different way. So spending time thinking and wondering on his own and with friends, staying apart while staying connected. Who was rejecting the alienation and despair he felt under capitalist demands of productivity in favor of creativity and rest and introspection, and rejecting resignation in favor of interconnection and interdependence, a communion with, as I said before, the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, all life. Many of his neighbors may have thought he was weird, but he was held in loving community during those 2 years at Walden, supported by Emerson and his mother and so many others. And he eventually wrote Walden. You remember the first few pages? He's like, so I'm writing this as an explanation of what I've been doing. It was an explanation to his wider community about what he'd been doing with that time he'd been gifted, right? I disagree with a lot of Thoreau's conclusions and ideas, but like Mary Oliver, he asks us good questions, and his legacy challenges us in some powerful ways. We honor his legacy we can honor his legacy in a lot of beautiful ways that benefit all of us. We can take up the challenge to listen to the natural world and to our human neighbors, even and especially the weird ones, even and especially our unhoused neighbors, right? Our addicted neighbors, our neighbors who may be of different religious traditions, who may come from different countries, right? To listen across difference and to listen to the still small voice within us that may be our conscience or the spirit of love or a connection to the divine interdependent whole. We can take up the challenge to do what is right, even if it is uncomfortable or awkward or not socially acceptable, as Thoreau did when he spent a night in jail rather than support the American-Mexican War with his tax money. And we can take up the challenge to fight for the well-being of all those around us, regardless of how much capital they produce, to keep insisting on the inherent worth and dignity of every person, every human life, and on every person's right to rest and nourishment and joy. Henry David Thoreau refused to succumb to despair or to conclude that the world is empty and meaningless, and his grief and frustration with capitalism, with all of the ways that the world was hurting them and cared about. He went into the woods of his town, and ultimately he built not just a cabin, but a legacy of connection, a legacy that challenges us to cultivate together a vision for a more just and equitable world. A world where we support and honor each other, even those who seem to throw their lives away, where we can let ourselves practice joy and grieve and be fully and wonderfully human together, even when we are apart. Please, I invite you to join me in singing along to our final hymn.
stirring thrill in your soul, in your soul. From the place where you stand to the outermost strand, do you hear, oh my friend, do you hear all the dreams, all the tears, all the sighs, all the prayers, they are yours, mine and theirs. Do you hear, do you hear?
We extinguish this chalice, but not the warmth of this community or the love that holds us even when we are far from each other. Dear ones, you are enough and you are not alone. Neil, can you share with us that one last image? Here we go. So I just invite you to remember that we are saying nope, 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 to succumbing to alienation under capitalism and concluding that the world is empty and meaningless. And we are saying yep, yup, 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 to building caring, long-lasting relationships with chosen friends and family, and collectively working for a vision of a better, truer, more just world. That together we are committed to joy, to humor, to being our best selves as best we are able, to supporting and uplifting each other. And at this time, I'm going to end our Facebook live stream. Thank you for all those who've joined us on Facebook today. We are so glad you are with us. And we're moving now into our coffee hour time when we'll be contemplating the question, what is sustaining us? What is sustaining us? How can we build more joy into our lives? I'm going to stop the recording as well.